And here we are. Welcome to another edition of Post-Gazette Live, the big show we call it. Every day at 5 we get on and we talk a little bit about Pittsburgh sports here at Post-Gazette. And of course, I'm Paul Zeise. I do it every day. We try and do it as much as we can do it. It's kind of a weird time right now in Pittsburgh sports because we're sort of in that lull, especially the Penguins really not playing very well, though they have won 2 in a row. What we have to look forward to, pitchers and catchers reporting and baseball getting started. But, of course, in this town, that doesn't always translate to much of anything other than we have some stuff to talk about from in April and May, and then they're eliminated. And that's the way it goes. So, anyway, as you can see, I am actually on location. I keep saying every week, hey, I'm going to get down to Archie's and do the show from Archie's. Archie's a great friend of me, but also a great friend of all of really the media outlets in this town. And he's a great guy. And, of course, as we always start with, the game is always on at Archie's. Archie's on Carson Street, home of 80-cent wings Monday through Thursday, home of the Paul Zeise grilled cheese sandwich. And, of course, it's where I'm at. So if you're not doing anything, come down to Archie's on Carson Street and join us for the big show. Some development that we'll start with respect to Russell Wilson, which, by the way, if you happen to watch the Pro Bowl or whatever we're calling that thing that happened yesterday, the flag football game involving NFL players, Russell Wilson played. I saw it through at least one touchdown pass. I'm not sure what that exactly means other than he threw a touchdown pass in a flag football game. But he said he was asked about, obviously Pete Carroll getting hired with the Raiders. He was asked about it, and he was asked about whether or not he has interest in going to the Raiders and whether or not he wants to be reunited with Pete Carroll. And he basically said, I love the guy. We have a good relationship. We obviously won a Super Bowl together, but I'm focused on the Steelers. I'm focused on signing with the Steelers. And so here's what I would tell you that leads me to believe. I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. But it leads me to believe that maybe Russell Wilson is going to be willing to take one of these team-friendly deals just to stay. And if that's the case, I think the Steelers might have no choice but having to basically sign him. I don't know that they're going to be able to do because, I saw it today as well. Spot Track, the website that tracks all the contracts in sports, basically set the market value for Justin Fields at about $7 million a year right now. Well, I mean, if the Steelers can get him for $7 million a year and sign Russell Wilson for 15 or 20, now you've got 2 quarterbacks again for $22 million. But I think the biggest problem with all of that is this. You've got 2 guys who want to be starters. One of them is a young guy, and he's still pretty young, and he's still trying to get, his shot to be a starter again because he was a starter with the Bears. The other guy knows he's at the end of his career. So at the end of the day, you're probably not going to be able to convince them both to come back. And if you do, you're probably not going to be able to convince Justin Fields to come back unless he's going to be guaranteed to have a real opportunity to be the starter. I mean, to me, again, I think if Russell Wilson's out here publicly telling people his priority is the Steelers, it means that he's probably going to give them a deal that they might say, this is an offer we can't refuse. And as I've said many times, it's important to note that Russell Wilson is probably, along with Justin Fields, they're probably the 2 best quarterbacks available. And so I'm going to be real interested now to see how this all plays out. To me, if you're the Steelers, what you need to do is you need to get this over with very quickly. You need to basically bring them both in, sit them both down, talk to them, kind of get with their agents and figure out what it's going to cost to sign them, and then make the deal that makes the most sense for you. That's what you have to do. And so I feel like at the end of the day, when you look at it that way, I just don't see a whole lot of movement going to happen with respect to the quarterbacks here in Pittsburgh. And I also think there's a really good chance that we could be talking about the same exact situation to start next year as we ended this year with, and that is with Russell Wilson as the starter, Justin Fields, as sort of the change of pace guy that gets about 5 plays a game or 4 plays a game. And I hope that's not the case, because I think that you either have to commit to Justin Fields or let him go. I mean, him as a backup makes no sense for the Steelers, if you ask me. You have Russell Wilson, who's a drop back passer, who, is mobile a little bit, but at the end of the day, he's not like this guy who's like a running quarterback. To me, you need to get a backup that kind of has the same skill set, so that if he gets hurt, you plug him right into the offense. When you have 2 completely different kinds of quarterbacks, it can be a little bit tricky within a season if you have to use them both. So I think that this is something the Steelers need to get out ahead of and really, really attack and make sure that they get it in a position where, by the end of this week or maybe early in the next week, certainly before the combine, they're at a place where, now all of a sudden they're at a place where they know exactly where they're going to go. And so I think that's the key to me in a million ways. That's the key to me. It's just one of those things. This is nothing else gets settled with the Steelers until the Steelers decide what they're going to do at quarterback. I mean, that's just really it. And so they need to get it done and get it out of the way. In the division, big news of the day, though, involves a divisional player who we are very familiar with here for probably all of the wrong reasons, and that is Myles Garrett of the Browns. Have you seen this? Myles Garrett issued a statement, and I'm just going to read it because, to me, I think it's beautiful, to be honest. I mean, we like to make fun of the Browns all the time because the Browns, are the Browns and they lose and everything else. And of course, their fans don't like to hear it. But here's what Myles Garrett's statement said. As a kid dreaming of the NFL, all I focused on was the ultimate goal of winning a Super Bowl. And that goal fuels me today more than ever. My love for the community of Northeast Ohio, the incredible fan base of the Browns, has made this one of the toughest decisions of my life. These past 8 years have shaped me into the man I am today. While I love calling this city my home, my desire to win and compete on the biggest stages won't allow me to be complacent. The goal was never to go from Cleveland to Canton. It has always been to compete for and win a Super Bowl. With that in mind, I've requested to be traded from the Cleveland Browns. Now, you want to talk about a total gut punch to the Browns. If you think about it, right? They have basically gone from, in a couple of years ago, remember, they were flying high. They beat the Steelers in the playoffs. They had Baker Mayfield and they scored 50-some points against the Steelers, and boy, this was a team that was on the rise, and they put together a really good a complement of players. And then at the end of the day, they just completely sort of collapsed. And I think a couple things happened. One, someone there made the decision to go away from Baker Mayfield because, if you remember, he was hurt. He had a bad shoulder, and they thought his shoulder wasn't going to get any better. So that was the first thing. In doing that, they then made maybe the worst trade in sports history and gave the worst contract in sports history to Deshaun Watson, if you think about it. And so, they ended up giving up a bunch of picks. Then they, had some issues with some injuries along their offensive line. And the whole thing sort of just started to crumble. And it crumbled really underneath the weight of the fact that it has a quarterback that they owe $250 million to who stinks. And so now, if you think about it, they are in a place where they have all kinds of cap issues. They have, still quarterback issue, which, by the way, had they just stayed with Baker Mayfield, they wouldn't have a quarterback issue. And so to me, I look at that and I say, it's really, really important for the Browns to try and clean up the mess that is their salary cap situation. They've got to figure out a way to move on from Deshaun Watson. I'm not even sure how they can do that. But I do think it's kind of interesting because I've seen a lot of people say this today. TJ Watt should do the same thing. TJ Watt should be out there. He should be doing the same thing. He should be demanding a trade because he's never going to win with the Steelers. I think it's a bit harsh, just from the standpoint of the Steelers are at least at a place where they make the playoffs. I mean, you could conceivably see Steelers get a good quarterback, get a couple of players around the quarterback, receiver, whatever, maybe get a left tackle, whatever, a couple of players, and all of a sudden, I could conceive of them being a little bit of a contender. I'm not saying they're going to win the Super Bowl, but I can conceive of them being a contender. Now, the question becomes, are they going to become a contender quick enough for TJ Watt to benefit from it? Because that's the other issue that I have is I think TJ Watt's got one more year left on his contract. And if you're the Steelers, I know this is a very, very unpopular opinion. I don't know if you can give him another $90 or $100 million deal. I think when you look at his body of work, it's just one of those guys who I think if you look at the end of these seasons, his body has been beat up and he's getting older. He's no spring chicken anymore. And I think when you look at the production you're going to get, I mean, he's got a $30 million cap hit this year. In order for you to continue to move on with him, if he's willing to go year to year or, one of these deals where it's a 2-year deal, but the second year is a team option and really not that hard for them to get out with not that much of a buyout, I can go with that. But I think at the end of the day, if you're the Steelers, you've got to think about how many times or how much more he has in the tank. Some edge rushers keep going until they're, 35, 34, 35 years old. But I look at him and I say, his body breaks down. He plays almost every game, but again, I think in the last 3 games, I think including the playoff game, I think there was something like he had 170 snaps and 0 tackles or some ridiculous stat like that. 1 quarterback pressure, no sacks, all that stuff. I just don't think it's, I don't think it's somebody that you can really commit that much money to. But either way, he has not been very good in the playoffs because I really believe that he's beat up, period. And I think that if your body's beat up and you're worn down, you have a real hard time playing at the level that you need to play at. And that's the problem he has. So I think that, the Steelers, I mean, I could see where he would want to maybe try and move on and go, trophy hunting. But by the same token, I think Steelers are in a place where maybe they should go and think about, hey, we could probably trade this guy in the offseason and get something for him. Because I do think there's value in TJ Watt. I do. And I think that, that to me, if you can trade him for, draft picks, give yourself a chance to get a little bit younger, you know what? That might make some sense. That might make some sense. But by the same token, I just think that you've got to be careful because you move on from a really good player who's still got a lot to give. It can be very, very, very difficult to find his production, at least for the first 15 or 16 weeks of the season. Now, I saw an interesting list that was put out, and it's by Spot Track, by the same website that does, values of players and all that other good stuff. And, what the guy that runs that does is he's really, really in tune with salary cap situations. He's really in tune with contracts and all that other stuff. But he's got a list of potential NFL trade candidates based on a number of factors. And on the list, of course, is George Pickens. Again, I don't know that the Steelers are going to move him, but if they do, they better be able to go out and find another receiver or two, because they don't have enough players at that position. See, my thing is, I get it why people want to move on from George Pickens. I get it why people want to, push him out the door, and I get it. I get all that, but he's still your best player on offense, and you don't really have anybody who's even close to being your second best player. So if you're going to move on from him, you better offer a package and be able to figure out a package of guys that are going to make your receiving core better. I always hear addition by subtraction. Well, that's easier said than done. It's much easier said than done. And so I think that, you look at George Pickens, he's got some baggage. I get it. He's hard to deal with. I get it. He's a pain in the butt. I get it. But he's still really, really good. And so you have to be able to replace his production. But there's some other guys on this list that are interesting. Deebo Samuel. Here's my thing with Deebo Samuel. What are you going to get for him? I mean, this year it looked like it was an out of shape, old, whatever receiver that wasn't very good, that didn't catch the ball very well. At one point, he was, on track to be in like the ultimate weapon, one of the best players in the league. What are you going to get for him now? Sam Hubbard from the Bengals, that would be an interesting, that'll be interesting to see if, what they can get for him. Tyreek Hill from the Dolphins. I mean, bad guy, really talented player. I mean, I guess if you're going to trade George Pickens and you can end up with Tyreek Hill, it's an upgrade. But you're going from one headache to another headache, essentially. In fact, Tyreek Hill, the thing about his headache is he's a much, much better player than George Pickens. So these are Kyle Pitts. Now, that's a guy, because of his ties to Arthur Smith, could be an interesting pickup for the Steelers, right? Kyle Pitts, if they could figure out a way to trade for him. I know that they've got Mount Washington and they've got Freiermuth, but it really, come on. The reality is those guys are not nearly as good as Kyle Pitts. And I think Kyle Pitts wasn't used the right way in Atlanta either. So to me, it's just one of those situations where there are going to be some guys that are available. There are going to be some players that are out there that maybe could help the Steelers. And the Steelers also are going to have to make some really tough decisions when it comes to, I think, Watt, to be honest. I mean, maybe you're going to sign him to an extension, maybe not. But you got Watt. Pickens is another one. Got to make a decision with him, too. You're either going to sign him to an extension or you're going to have to trade him. And if you trade him, you better have a better plan. See, like last year, they didn't have a plan for Deontay Johnson. Didn't have a plan. And so because they didn't have a plan for Deontay Johnson, what happens is when they traded him, they ended up with, 5 guys named Mo as the guys behind George Pickens on their receiving corps. That's not good enough. Never is going to be good enough to have those kind of players. If that's your, player 2, 3, 4, 5, at the receiving position. So, it's going to be, along with the quarterback stuff, I think Watt's contract, I think Pickens' contract are two things to watch between now and, say, the draft, to figure out if those guys are going to sign them or are they going to try and move them. I mean, I know there's a lot of people that say you can't move Watt. I think you can. I really do. The other guy I think you can move is Minkah Fitzpatrick, depending on what you can get back for him. Interestingly enough, I saw a quote from one anonymous GM who said he'd be willing to give up 2 first-round picks and more for Myles Garrett. My first thought on that is you're probably a GM that's looking to get fired, because that's way too much to give up for Myles Garrett. But who am I? What do I know? That's sort of the developments today in the NFL, of course, with the Steelers. I will say one thing that seems really weird, and as I'm doing this, by the way, Roger Goodell is actually speaking to the media, doing his yearly at the Super Bowl State of the NFL Union address. So I can't even talk, on what he's saying. Obviously, I'll have to do it tomorrow when we figure it out, what he said. If he says anything that's somewhat relevant, he usually doesn't. It's usually an hour of maybe the worst kind of press conference where he just basically talks in lawyer speak and doesn't really say anything that's all that interesting. But maybe he will, so we'll figure that out tomorrow. Did you see? I know it's a different kind of story, but this is the kind of story that I got to be honest with you, I cannot believe does not happen a lot more. I can't. And that is this guy, Pat Hobart, the umpire, right, was fired. He had been, under investigation for gambling activity. And so when it comes to gambling activities, he shared a legal sports betting account with a friend who bet on baseball. And so he intentionally deleted messages in order to try and, get the investigation off of his trail. So basically, he adamantly denied betting on baseball directly or indirectly, and said there was no evidence that he bet directly on games or manipulated the outcomes of any games. So that's good, but they fired him because he failed to uphold the integrity of the game. And he should have known that his friend, who's a professional poker player, by the way, bet baseball from the shared account. Now, first of all, who is it in the world that shares a betting account with somebody? But I'll be honest with you. Next week is the Super Bowl. And, of course, the Chiefs are going to play in the Super Bowl. And if the Chiefs are involved in a game, there are all these conspiracies about referees on the take. It's the worst nightmare for every one of these sports leagues. And guess what? Because gambling has become so prevalent in this world, especially, you can pick up your phone and bet on, whatever you want to bet on right from your phone, right? Doesn't even take that much to do it. This is the biggest fear of all of these leagues, is that umpires or referees or whatever get caught up in a gambling scandal. And if that happens, it really undermines the integrity of the game. It really makes the game, all of the games, all of the outcomes of the games, it makes them really come under scrutiny. And again, I think one of the biggest things about this is this is a Major League Baseball umpire, but could you imagine if it was a NFL referee and it turned out that this was an NFL referee that worked the AFC Championship game with the Chiefs and the Bills? Or if it was, something like that. I don't know. What would you think? It would be very, very interesting. And it would also be a real headache. So it's one of those stories that we're going to continue to follow. But I honestly just don't know that. I can't believe it doesn't happen so much more often. Like, really, I think about it all the time. People already don't trust the outcome of these games. They already don't trust the outcome of these games. They don't believe they're refereed or officiated fairly. They don't really, if you think about it, every time there's a big game, think about it, go to social media every time there's a big game, and what are people talking about? The officials. Bad calls. Calls that went one way or it should have went the other way. Missed calls. All that. That's what people are talking about. And it gets to a point where there's a fear. There's a fear that if one of these officials gets found out to be, like this, Hoberg, this umpire, he wasn't even betting on sports, but he had a shared account with a professional gambler. That's a huge red flag. My question would be this. If you're not betting on baseball and you're not betting on sports and you're not somebody that's a risk for this kind of thing, guess what? Why do you have a shared account with a professional gambler? I mean, you have to know better than that. And I think one of the things that the league, and I'm sure, Roger Goodell is probably talking about it right now as we speak, as he meets with the media. I think one of the things you have to do as a league is you have to preserve the integrity at all costs. You've got to figure out how to do it. That's why this is such a big story. Like 20 years ago, was it Tim Donaghy, the NBA ref, who basically, uncovered a whole lot of stuff that goes on in terms of how they try and manipulate games in the NBA. That was like 20 years ago. Obviously, they brought the house down. I think he went to prison and everything else. But for the most part, that was at a time before all of these sports leagues were in bed with gambling. All of these sports leagues were now they're all in bed with FanDuel and DraftKings and all these gambling sites and all this other stuff. I think it's really going to be very, very interesting to see going forward how many more of these situations happen. Because that's, I think, the biggest fear of all of these leagues. We had Terry Rozier, the NBA player. Last year, we had the NBA player that was betting on himself, his prop bets, and then he was pulling himself out of games. He was betting under on his prop bets and then pulling himself out of games. I mean, to me, I think this stuff goes on probably a lot more than you think. And I think that we're going to start to see more of these scandals because gambling is such a big part of our culture. It's a big part of these leagues. It's a big part of, the fact that you can pick up your phone. You can basically on your computer, whatever, from wherever you're at, you can place bets. And I always say that is why there's so much more scrutiny on these officials now than there ever has been, because people are betting more than they've ever bet. So now we all have a much more interest in the actual results, and we want to, look at them all the same way. And so every one of these calls that goes one way or another that swings a game, guess what? We're going to scrutinize it because most of us have bets riding on it, in some regard. That's the biggest fear of all these leagues. It is, and I think that's this umpire, getting fired. And he didn't. It sounds like he didn't even bet on baseball, but the appearance of him betting on baseball was more than enough for them to say we cannot have this. Because if anybody out there who bets, who's a gambler, if they can't trust the integrity of the game is lost. By the way, the game is always on here at Archie's. By the way, I'm at Archie's. The game's always on at Archie's. Archie's, home of 80-cent wings. Monday through Thursday, home of the Paul Zeise grilled cheese sandwich. Get down to Archie's on Carson Street. When you get down here, say hello to Archie. All weekend long, they have got all the games, all weeknights, all the Penguin games, all the Pitt games, all the West Virginia games, whatever you want to watch, they have it on here at Archie's. So get down to Archie's. And again, I'm here, and hopefully we can do more from down here because this is a great place to be. Until tomorrow, we're going to start talking about the Super Bowl, which, by the way, there's not a lot of hype about the Super Bowl, is there? Doesn't seem like it. Doesn't seem like people are all that excited about this matchup. But tomorrow we'll get more into that. We'll talk and break down the actual game and try and maybe make some sense of the Chiefs dynasty and what winning their 4th Super Bowl in 6 years would mean for them. So we'll do all those things. Until then, enjoy your night. And, of course, stay out of trouble. And if you aren't busy, get down here to Archie's and join us for some fun in the sun.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.